We are so glad that you could join us. If you're watching us live or on the replay, thank you for tuning in. And we hope that today is really helpful in your growing and your healing. That's our heart, is to be of service. And we hope that this serves you in some way. And today we are going to be talking about grief. Healing through the 6 stages of grief. And I'm Kristen Boice. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and the owner of Pathways to Healing Counseling. And we have a heart to help others free themselves from the past so they can live more fully in the present and not feel tortured in their own minds with shame and anxiety and guilt. And so today I am joined with Roxie Stone, my dear friend Roxie, and I'm so glad you're with me, Roxie, today. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing about your expertise in this topic.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Yes. So Roxie has been in the field for over, how many years would you say, Roxie?
Way too many, Kristen. Over 40 for sure.
Yeah. And many different facets. She was at St. Vincent's Stress Center for over 15 years. Mm-hmm. She's also was an adjunct professor at Butler University. Go Dogs, my alma mater.
Good Tigers for my DePaul friends out there.
There you go. There you go. And so, and you've seen many facets of anxiety, depression, grief, trauma throughout your career. And you bring a wealth of knowledge, and I'm thrilled that you're here with us today. Is there anything you want to add about yourself or share with the listeners?
No, I think you hit the highlights. I've been around in the field a long time. I've worked in, I think, treatment at every level, from inpatient through partial hospitalization and IOP and outpatient. And then all that, I've had my own private practice for about 40 years too. And then left to take care of my mother when she had dementia, and was fortunate enough to get the opportunity to come to Pathways. So I'm very grateful for that.
We are so happy you're at Pathways. I couldn't envision it without you. So
thank you.
You're a gift, truly. Today we're going to be talking about what was the 5 stages of grief with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and then David Kessler recently added a 6th stage of grief, finding meaning. So I thought what we could do is I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of walk us through. Let's start with the 1st stage of grief, if you don't mind, and we're going to talk about how that's impacting all of us.
The 1st stage of grief is denial, and it's absolutely one of those that impacts us all. When we're talking about any kind of loss, it's there. If we're talking about the death of a loved one, oftentimes it can manifest itself not by actually denying that the person died, but oftentimes it's expecting the person to come through the door. Or I know for me, with the loss of my mom, sometimes waking up on Saturday morning and thinking, oh, I have to go visit. No, I don't. Or with my dad, anytime like I would get, hear good news about the Colts or any sports related activity, I would think, oh, my dad would love to hear. No, I can't call them. So it's more of those kinds of things. Maybe you expect somebody to walk through the door, or you think they're on a business trip or something, but not really. I mean, you down deep know that. I think if we're thinking about the pandemic, it seems like it plays out in a lot of it's not going to impact me. For a while it was over there in China and every place else, and maybe it won't come here to the United States. And it seems like it's only in the really big cities, New York and Seattle and, those big cities in California were hit really hard, and maybe it's not going to come here. Or really it only affects old people. I'm not that old. It's not going to impact me. And yet the reality is it can and it will. So denial, I think, plays a big part in the stages of grief, as in all of that. when she wrote the book about, for people who were dying, and then moved it to people who were grieving, and now with David as well.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to note when we talk about these stages of grief, they're not in a linear fashion. So it doesn't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You can come in and out of the different stages.
Absolutely. It would be nice if it were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, but it's not. And you can visit a stage several times. The other thing that I think is really, really important is that each loss for a person is grieved slightly differently, and sometimes dramatically differently. I come from a pretty large extended family, and most of them stayed around my hometown. So I've gone through a lot of relative deaths, and I know each one was slightly different for me, in part depending on the relationship that I had with the person, and also in part depending on where I was at that time. And that played a factor too. So it all comes down to each grief, each loss leads to grief, and each grief is individual and different from any other.
I really like how you said that, because you put that beautifully. That is so true. It depends on your relationship with the person. It depends on where you are on the like in your life. So I think that makes, and then everybody grieves kind of differently. So no two people are going to potentially grieve the same. How, when you think of ambiguous loss and denial, can you talk a little bit more about, we have deaths of physical people, and then we have divorces, we have loss of a job, and what we would call as ambiguous loss. Can you talk a little bit about that and denial?
Yeah, I think there are so many different kinds of losses, like you were talking about losing a job or a divorce, or sometimes loss of independence, or I know at some point my father lost his leg. There are lots of different kinds of things, and I think we do tend to deny right at first. That's one of the very first stages, kind of shocked that this is happening, and some kind of denial in terms of, this can't be happening. It can't be happening to me. I just can't believe it. Those kinds of things that go on in our heads, that we have difficulty kind of wrapping our brain around the fact that all of a sudden, usually, this is taking place. It really is happening, and even like with divorce, you may have been negotiating that all along, but all of a sudden it's real. It's there, and it's, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. And we say that a lot. I can't believe this has happened, or I can't believe, I can't believe I've been quarantined for forever. Those kinds of things that I think.
Yes.
Yeah. And they're all related to grief and loss, all of them.
Absolutely. And that kind of segues into our second stage. And what's the second stage?
Second stage is anger. And anger is really a part of grief. A lot of times we look for some reason that this happened, someone to blame, sometimes ourselves, why me? Why did this happen? Why now? Um, we we just look for some kind of explanation. We want to know, what is this all about? What happened? How did it happen? Why did it happen? All of those kinds of things. And I think with the pandemic, the thing that we've heard from a lot of people on the news is, you're making me stay home and stop my activities. You're making me wear a mask and I don't want to. Those kinds of things. And sometimes with other losses, you don't really you don't really have someone to blame sometimes, and sometimes we internalize that and blame ourselves.
Yeah. So we are, anger is an interesting one, because it can also kind of, it blocks us from connecting sometimes to the sadness that lies underneath it.
Yeah, and I think it may act as one of those secondary emotions in that time, because we don't want to feel the sadness at all. It's
Yeah.
easier to feel the anger.
It is because it's so painful, and
Mhm.
we wanna try to mitigate that pain. So
Mhm.
sometimes we kind of use anger to kind of pull the plug, and then sometimes it can be adaptive anger.
Yes, it can. It can, and sometimes it can lead people, get ahead of myself here a little bit, but onto the meaning stage and propel them into movement to do something, to honor somebody, to their loved one or whatever. Yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
So what's stage 3?
Stage 3 is a very interesting one too. I think it's bargaining. It's bargaining. And that is where we try to make all kinds of deals in our head or with God or with somebody to let us off the hook, so to speak. You know, it can be, if a prayer to God, if you save him or her or my loved one, I will, whatever, I will be good. I will go to church. I will donate money. I will, whatever. Related to the quarantine, I think it's, well, okay, I'll quarantine myself for a couple weeks and then I'm going to do what I want to do and those kinds of things. But it's that bargaining process that if this, then I will do something and then all of this loss will go away. Um, and it doesn't work that way, actually. I mean, we go through the bargaining, but the bargaining, typically doesn't work. Um,
Doesn't change the outcome.
yeah,
Yeah.
it doesn't change the outcome.
And what I find often is people will go back and say, if I had only made the phone call sooner,
Yeah.
if I had only help try to get the person help, if I had only gotten the right doctor,
Yeah.
then this wouldn't have happened.
I think this is where we get into our heads so much. And when we do what Brene Brown was talking about, the story I tell myself that may or may not be true. So often when we might blame ourselves for something, if only, like you said, if I had only done this, if I hadn't gone back to grab my phone, then we wouldn't have been at that intersection at exactly the second when there was the accident. Or, if I hadn't done this, or if I had prevented them from doing that, or, if I had known my child was taking drugs, then I would have done something different. There are a whole lot of if onlys and what ifs and all of those kinds of things that we go through in our heads. And most of the time, if we process that with somebody else, talk to somebody else, we begin to recognize what you said. It doesn't really change the outcome. And the what ifs and the if onlys are just what ifs and if onlys.
Yeah, and that's hard. That's where the grief comes in.
Right.
Um, yeah, and the sense of responsibility can be pretty significant.
Mhm.
And right now, when people are separated from their loved ones in the hospital, they can't be there. They
Mhm.
can't hold their hand. They can't advocate in person. They can certainly advocate over the phone, but it doesn't feel the same.
Yeah, it does it.
And so that's really tough right now is people aren't able to be there in person.
True. They're not. They're not. It's very difficult and it's hard. It's also hard on the frontline people who try to be there with people and hold their hands as they go through the dying process. From at least a couple clients that I've talked to and a friend who does that kind of work. And it's very, very difficult because typically we want to be together with our loved ones and we're wired for connection and we want to be with them.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a collective trauma from that
Oh, I think
because we're not wired to be separated when
yeah,
someone's going through the death process,
right.
the dying process.
And even now, not knowing, I know so many people whose parents are in facilities and they can't even visit. Um, so they're very disconnected, and within the facilities themselves, people are isolated to their own rooms, which is really, really hard for people who are older and people who have dementia, Alzheimer's, or some of those kinds of things, because change is hard for them. And then not only are they there, but they're taken away from community dining room. They can't see their family. They're just there. It's very difficult for them.
Yeah, and they might be confused on what's going
Mhm.
on. And
Yeah.
the workers, I want to acknowledge all the healthcare workers in the nursing homes, in the hospitals, and any kind of caretaking setting that you were just explaining. There is this sense of they're doing everything they can to walk the person and the family
Mhm.
through grief. And that's tough because they're now grief counselors,
Yeah.
whereas they weren't really, that wasn't part of their some have had that training, but a lot haven't.
A lot
And so
happens.
they've become now kind of these grief counselors in
Yeah.
the process of managing this.
Mhm. Yeah.
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 And then they have their own feelings and grief around what they're witnessing and what they're going through. So it's a really unprecedented time to really talk through grief.
It really is. Yeah.
Yeah.
It really is.
So what's the fourth stage of grief?
The fourth stage tends to follow the last one and moving into the depression, kind of acknowledging that, yes, this is the loss. Um, Sadness is here, um, incredible sadness sometimes. And again, we're wired for connection, and at this time, people are not having funerals. The social distancing keeps people apart from one another. From what I understand, some of the patients are being held because of the COVID virus. They have to be held for so many days before they're allowed to even do anything else with the bodies, and then they may be buried without family for a later memorial service. Families are in different places and can't necessarily come together. They're doing some online kinds of things. Mm. I know we had a colleague who went to an online funeral. Um, so it's just a very difficult time, to experience grief right now, to experience those kinds of losses.
It is. And as you were talking, I could feel the sadness rise up in me. I could feel the sadness and
Mhm,
just connect to that sadness of the losses
mhm.
and the powerlessness that people feel, the helplessness that people feel, and sometimes hopelessness that people feel
Yes.
around this time and losing a loved one.
Mhm.
And so I just wanted to take a moment just to acknowledge those that have lost somebody or you going through a loss. And even transition can show up as loss. So those that are transitioning back after being at home, those are also the same feelings can come up. Well,
Mhm.
maybe if I didn't do these hours, or maybe if I switch careers, or because there are feelings going back into the world. And I want to acknowledge those too, those folks that are feeling scared or apprehensive and grieving this recharge time. Some people have had a reset time that have really enjoyed it, others not so much. And there's no right, wrong, good, or bad.
Mhm. Mhm.
So sadness and depression are such a pervasive, I'm seeing that is a pervasive feeling that people are having right now. We call it depression. And like you said, underneath it is just a whole lot of sadness.
Yeah. There's a lot of sadness and fear. It seems to me, at least in the clients that I'm seeing right now, very much so. And
Yeah.
and a lot of fear about leaving the safety of the quarantine piece, you know, um, and we'll probably like you said, we'll probably grieve that, um, the loss of safety, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. And we're just kind of navigating this unknown territory. But I like how you brought up fear with the sadness. So do you think those often that is woven throughout this whole process of grief and the
It
stages of
is.
grief?
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah. So we move through sadness. And that one comes and goes. I feel like that one is one that will come up often in
Yeah.
the grieving process. And that's where the grief bursts come, where you're fine one minute, the next minute a song comes on and you're right back into the sadness
Mhm.
and the longing.
Yeah.
So there's a longing that comes with, I think, the sadness,
Mhm.
longing to hear the person's voice, longing to see their face, longing for one last hug.
Mhm. Definitely, definitely. I think I
Yeah.
agree with that. Yeah. And it does, you're right, it absolutely does come back and forth many, many, many times, and even when you have gone beyond and into the meaning part of it, you can still have something that happens that reminds you of whatever that triggers you in some way that you feel the sadness again. I think it's also important to mention not only do we have the bursts of grief, but there can be bursts of love that are triggered by a song or something, those kinds of things. And I know one of the things that I did last weekend, no, the weekend before last, was to sort through pictures. And it was kind of a bittersweet thing. It was, some bursts of grief a little bit, and then there were some bursts of love too. So that part was nice. Not the bursts of grief.
Yes.
Bursts of love were nice, yeah.
I like the bursts of love because the amount of grief you have is the amount of love you had for the person.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So what's the next stage? What's stage 5?
Stage 5 is acceptance. And that is where you really come to terms with the fact that the loss is real. The loss is real. And it can be a difficult one to get to. This is really happened, and I have to figure out how I'm going to live my life after the loss. I have to figure out what am I going to do. It doesn't mean, and I think people get confused here. It doesn't mean that it's okay that you think the loss is okay. It means you accept the fact that the person is gone, or you accept the fact that whatever you lost is gone. In the quarantine, you accept the fact that indeed it is happening, and I have to figure out how to proceed. Or in losing your independence, how am I going to live without being so independent? How am I going to manage? So it's kind of coming to terms with the new part of my life, and how will I manage that?
Yeah, and this can take a while. So some people, it could be years. They're like, I still can't believe they're gone.
Right, right. To bounce back to denial. But yes, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
And so people think, well, I should be at this stage and they should all over themselves. And I'm like, no, there's no should right now.
Other people kind of help in that should process too. I think that we have really, I don't know, sanitized grief in our culture or something along those lines, because other cultures do it so differently, and we used to do it differently. I know in one of David Kessler's article, he talked about our grandparents knew how to grieve better than we do. It was a whole community of support. And I remember in his book, he talked about the village in Australia. I thought that this was the most wonderful thing where people acknowledge that someone is grieving by putting out a piece of furniture from wherever they live and like put it in their front yard or whatever so that the grieving person wakes up the next day and the world is not the same because everybody has acknowledged his or her grief by changing the environment in the village. And I just thought that was wonderful. I remember specifically when my dad died, I had to fly alone. I had gone to family funerals out of town before, but always with somebody else. But I was flying alone. I remember just being struck by here my whole world changed and the world is going on just like it always does. And that is very different, I think, in other places. And even I don't know that they're doing it so much now because I think the Western world is very similar. But in the olden days, widows used to dress in black for about a year or two or something like that. And today we don't do a lot of those traditions and those rituals and those kinds of things. And those traditions and rituals can't be done right now because of COVID. So it's like a double-edged sword here, you know.
Yeah, I love those beautiful examples of community and support and acknowledgement because I think grief can be very lonely.
Hmm.
And I think you made an important point that the world keeps going on while your world got flipped upside down.
Hmm.
And everybody else seems to, and this is a common theme, I think, with grief. Everybody else seems to go on, and
Yeah,
my world just changed completely.
yeah, yeah.
And yet everybody else goes back to normal.
Yes. And and a lot of people sort of expect you to be back to normal in a very short period of time. You know, um, aren't aren't you over that yet, or don't you aren't you done with that? Aren't you ready to move on? Those kinds of things happen, and people say that to other people. And there's no time limit for grief. Absolutely none.
Yeah.
Absolutely
And
none.
that one's hard for people to get there because society doesn't communicate
Hmm.
that they have a hard time believing that. They think there's something wrong with them.
Yeah,
People, like you said, want them to quickly get through it.
right.
And and people say, well, they're in a better place. And it's like, yeah, that may be true, but that's not helpful to hear
No, that's
in
not.
grief
No.
because that makes it seem like to the person that's grieving, oh, then I shouldn't be sad.
Yeah.
I should just be done with this then and be grateful they're in a better place.
Mhm.
So it's
Absolutely.
almost creating shame and guilt that they have their feelings and they're normal. And that's a healthy part of grief is actually feeling all these stages are all a healthy part of the grieving process.
It's definitely. And that throws people into the shoulds. You know, I should be done with this by now. I shouldn't be continuing to grieve. I shouldn't be sad. I shouldn't do whatever. Yeah,
Yeah. And that keeps us stuck at our shame.
it does.
Like, I'm doing this wrong. I'm doing the grief wrong. There's
Mhm.
a right way to grieve, and I'm failing the test.
Mhm.
So a lot of grief is just we work on accepting just it's okay to have your feelings.
Yeah,
It's
definitely.
okay to let it out.
Yeah, and it's important to feel your feelings. uh, As a person who tried to stuff feelings for a long time, I've learned that the hard way. But it really is important to feel, and I know that we don't want to, because we don't want to go through the hard stuff.
Yeah, it's really hard. I liken it to like we think if we just do step one, two, three, then we can put this away and make it go away.
Yeah,
And it's like, yeah, it doesn't work. It's like a wave. It's like here it comes. You got to ride the wave, and then here comes the next wave.
yeah,
And being able to breathe through that and tolerate the feelings of discomfort is
mhm,
really important in the grieving process.
it is.
Yeah.
It really is.
So, what is the new stage of grief that was recently developed by David Kessler? Can you tell us about that stage?
Well, the new stage is finding meaning, and I think that's a really important stage. And it doesn't happen right away. It doesn't happen right away, and sometimes it's even years later or a long time later. And I think it's hard for people to do that sometimes. People get stuck on it. You know, there's no sense in the fact that so and so died, but it's really looking for meaning in the person's life rather than trying to make sense out of an accident or whatever happened, or trying to find meaning in in COVID, for example. Um, Trying to find a way to cope, find meaning in that. I, personally hope that it brings us more into community. And I know you know that I tend to fall on the introverted side, but boy, I sure do miss people. And and
Yeah.
that it when it changes, I want to be able to spend more time with people and the people that I care about and those kinds of things. So yeah, and people do different things to find meaning. Some people, I know the woman who founded Mothers Against Drunk Driving, found meaning after one of her children was killed by a drunk driver, or the Adam Walsh who found
Yeah.
yeah, the about the missing child after he lost his child. There are lots of things that you can do, and it doesn't have to be, quite that large. I know one person who is lost a child most recently, a very creative child, and she's taking photographs of some of the things that she had created. It was a floral arrangement kind of thing, and is going to make a display on the wall. Um, so there are lots of different things that you can do in order to try to find meaning. Sometimes, if it's a complicated relationship, um, some people, well, at least from according to David Kessler's book, try to make changes in their own behavior to sort of compensate for that. Like if they had an argument with somebody and then never made up with them, and then that person died, well, I won't let so much time pass before we make up. So there can be lots of different things that you do in order to try to find meaning in the person's life. One of the things that he talks about too is that if you look at like mind, body, and spirit, that the reality is when someone goes, the body is gone, but we still carry them with us. We still carry feelings about them. We carry them. Sometimes we repeat conversations with them over in our head. It's just that one part that is gone. So you can do a lot of things to help nurture that relationship, actually, because you can still have a relationship with someone who is dead. Um, and that was a very different perspective for me to read about that. I found that very interesting.
Yeah. And the book where Roxie is alluding to is this book. It's called Finding Meaning, The Sixth Stage of Grief by David Kessler. This is his new book. I went to his training in January, which is so interesting because who knew that COVID would be the situation. But I deal with grief, and you deal with grief in our own lives and with clients on a regular basis. And so this book is a really helpful book in terms of navigating the finding meaning process. Would you say, Roxie? Is that how you felt about it?
Yeah, definitely. I thought it was very helpful. Very helpful. It's been helpful to clients to read too.
Talk about when people have to clean out someone's home or possessions, because some people have a hard time parting ways with the stuff because the memories and associations get connected to the item.
Yes, definitely.
Can you talk through a little bit about that? Because I think that impacts so many people.
I think it does too. It very much so. And people, like you said, that they do make the connection and think, if I get rid of X, whatever it is, then I'm breaking the connection with my loved one. And I certainly don't want to do that. Or it means that I don't love them enough that I'm getting rid of something that they have or had. Um, and it means that I didn't love them enough, or I'm breaking the connection, or something that I'm moving on. And if I really loved them, I would keep everything exactly as it is and wouldn't move on. When, you know, try to think about, how does that person want to see me? Do they want to see me stuck in my grief and not moving on? Or do they want to see me moving on with my life? And I'm guessing that they would want to see me moving on with my life. And if it's a really significant kind of thing, you can always take a picture of it, or whatever you want to do, or it can live in your memory, or lots of different kinds of options. But yeah, I think you're right. A lot of people do. those kinds of things, and just hold on to it forever. Some people don't ever change somebody's room from the time that they died, and just keep it that way. It may even close the door and lock it, and not ever change it or use it or anything.
And I think that's a metaphor, closing the door on the grief, closing the door on the feelings and the emotions, because it's painful.
Mm-hmm.
Opening the door.
Yes, it is. It's very painful.
Yeah. It's painful, even the fear of, if I give this item up, then what if I want it back, which is a lot of anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
And you're really trying to hold on to, again, like you said, that person.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a process. You're going through even these stages. That's why I think it's so, even you're going through kind of a bargaining, a denial. You're going through denial, anger, bargaining, sadness.
Yeah.
So I think, there's some metaphors in terms of the stuff that can be really pertinent to these stages of grief.
Mm-hmm.
And how hard it is to grieve.
Yeah, it's very difficult. It's very difficult, and it takes time. Again, it's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 done. No, not like that at all.
Because people ask me, how much longer do you think I'll feel like this?
Yeah.
How much longer do you think I'll be like this? I'm like, take a deep breath. Let's accept where you are right now, and it's okay. Because if we have a finish line, kind of like with COVID, if I just know, then that's the bargaining. If I just know, then I can prepare myself.
Mm-hmm.
And that grief is very uncertain and unknown.
Yes,
and each minute you don't know how you're going to feel. And that's so true about grief, because we just don't know what one, and that's why I say we take it 1 second at a time, really, with grief.
Mm-hmm.
1 minute at a time.
Yeah. And this grief is different than the previous grief. There may be similarities, but it's different.
Yeah. So if you're grieving, let's say you were grieving grandma and then you lost dad, that's going to be it's not going to look the same. No, potentially. Right. Different relationship, different emotions connected to it. So like you said, I like how you put that, no two grieving processes are the same.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. So what are some coping strategies as we close out that we could offer folks going through grief? We're all going to go through grief. This is the thing. Nobody is not going to go through grief. Everybody is going to, everybody. And this is what we're facing. We're facing grief in a whole new way that we kind of wanted to not, we didn't want to even look at it. So what are some healthy coping strategies?
One of the things that can be very helpful is a support group. We're wired for connection, and there are lots of support groups. Grief Share is certainly one that a lot of churches offer. Hospice groups have support groups. Let's see, Brooks Place. David Kessler at grief.com offers a support group. And he has just added what he's calling a Facebook pop-up group. And that's for anybody. It is at 1:00 California time. And when I checked, that would be 4:00 Eastern time. So you can just go to grief.com, and there's a way to get to this pop-up support group. So that's available. His books are very helpful as well. I think one of the things that is essential that you talked about a little bit here is the deep breathing is critical, and feeling the feelings and getting to that point where you can and where you do. I think movement, yoga, journaling, all of those kinds of things can be very, very helpful. And certainly I would support seeing a therapist, as there are lots of good therapists around too.
Yeah, I think those are really important. And the support, there's free. So the grief.com, he had that Facebook group is free.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of free resources, and Grief Share is typically zero cost or minimal cost. So those are options that if you have some financial constraints that are still available and would be a good fit. And when we talk about the deep breathing, that is an essential component to tolerate the sadness, to be able to say, okay, I can handle this. And that's what we call square breathing. So we can practice it right now as a form of kind of closing out our time together, because it might have opened up a few emotions, I'm guessing, if you have walked through grief. And I just want to honor and acknowledge you and say you're brave and courageous for showing up and spending time with us, because it can be hard to face these feelings. So thank you for your courage to show up. So we're going to practice together to close our time out. So what we're going to do is, the first thing I want really is important is to stay in your body. And this is something nobody teaches us. A lot of times we leave our body and we go someplace else in our head. I might go to my to-do list. Have you ever been in your car and you're like, did I stop at that stop sign? Oh my gosh, did I stop at that stoplight? Totally done that because I'm not present. And so the first thing we teach in our therapy process is really centering yourself so you can feel like you can handle it. So we're going to put our feet on the floor. This is really important in pushing your heels into the ground. And so we're going to push down into our heels, and we're going to inhale for 4. We're going to hold for 4. We're going to release for 8. And we're going to slowly, when we inhale, we're going to go through our nose, and when we exhale, out our mouths. And what this does is it helps regulate what we call the parasympathetic nervous system. So it helps us go into a calm state in our bodies. Instead of when we flip our lids, my little Dan Siegel brain model, when we flip our lids into fight, flight, or freeze, this is the state where we kind of go offline and we feel like we can't tolerate things. And so I want to get to the calm brain, the higher centers of the brain. So this is the brain stem back here. It's a survival state. This is where the calm brain lies. This is our executive function. So we're going to do this together just to help regulate your nervous system and be able to recenter. So pressing your feet into the floor, we're going to inhale for 4 through our nose, hold for 4, and release for 8. You'll notice I kind of pursed my lips like I'm cooling soup, and that's to slow the breath down on that exhale so we get the full benefit of the breath. So let's do one more together as we close out our time. Inhale through our nose. Just check in with your body and notice the difference. You might feel a little lightheaded if you're not used to doing these deep breaths. And I invite you to do this every hour. And it's something we teach often is to continuously tap into that breath in order to move through the feelings of grief. So we can tolerate connecting to those emotions and know we will get through it. It's like riding that wave, and the breath helps us ride that wave so we can get back to status quo until the next emotion comes. And so I want to thank you, Roxie, for your heart, your time, and your presence with us today.
Thank you, Kristen. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
It's been a real gift. And I hope that if you know anybody going through the grieving process, please share this. It will be live. The replay will be available on Pathways to Healing Counseling, and it'll also be on the YouTube. There'll be a YouTube link to it as well. But if you want to share it with anyone that's struggling right now, whether they're in quarantine, they've lost a job, or they've lost a loved one, or they're losing somebody right now in the dying process, please share this, and hope it's a resource to be able to know they're not alone and there is support out there, because grief can feel lonely, and it's important that there's a sense of community and connection during this really difficult time. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Roxie, and thank you for everybody. And let us know what other questions you might have for future lives. We are going to do another live next Monday on walking someone through the dying process. And I know that's a vulnerable topic, and we're going to face it. We're going to have hard conversations and face hard emotions and face pain. This is a community where you can come to face all those emotions and the pain. We're here to support you. So I hope everyone has a good rest of their week. And until next Monday, we'll see you at 11:40 on Monday for the next live. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.